The town of Redstone was a quiet, sun-baked dot on the map, known for its friendly folks and sleepy charm. Camille Shaw, a disabled veteran in her late 30s, had chosen it as her sanctuary. Her modest home, nestled at the edge of town, was a place of quiet recovery after years of service in an elite military unit. She kept to herself, her days spent gardening, reading, and mentoring a handful of local teens who found her quiet strength inspiring. But peace has a way of attracting trouble. It began one afternoon at Jake's Diner, the local gathering spot where Camille occasionally went for coffee and pie. She had just wheeled herself to a table near the window when the sound of roaring engines announced the arrival of unwelcome visitors. Three men in leather jackets sauntered in, their boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. The air in the diner shifted, conversations quieted, and a few patrons exchanged uneasy glances. The leader of the group, a man with a jagged scar running across his cheek, scanned the room before his eyes landed on Camille. His grin widened. "Well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice carrying a mocking edge as he approached her. Camille kept her focus on the menu, refusing to meet his gaze. Years of discipline had taught her how to diffuse situations without unnecessary escalation. Scar leaned against her table, his fingers drumming against its surface. "You too good to say hello, sweetheart?" he drawled. Camille looked up, her face calm but her eyes sharp. "Just here for coffee," she said evenly. His companions chuckled, emboldened by their leader's antics. "You don't look like you belong here," one of them sneered. "What's a cripple like you doing in a place like this?" A hush fell over the diner. The insult hung in the air, but Camille's expression didn't waver. She calmly folded her menu and placed it on the table. "Enjoy your meal," she said, her tone dismissive. Scar didn't like being ignored. He reached out, snatching the menu from the table and tossing it aside. "You think you're better than us?" he snarled. Before Camille could respond, Jake, the owner of the diner, stepped forward, his voice firm. "That's enough. Leave her alone." Scar turned to Jake, his grin returning. "Relax, old man. We're just having a friendly chat." "Friendly's not what I'd call it," Jake said, crossing his arms. "You're scaring off my customers. Pay for your coffee and get out." Scar's grin faltered, but he wasn't ready to back down. He glared at Camille one last time, leaning closer. "We'll be seeing you, sweetheart." With that, he and his gang turned and left, the sound of their laughter and roaring engines fading into the distance. That evening, Camille returned home, her mind replaying the events at the diner. She had dealt with worse during her time in the military, but something about these men set her on edge. Their arrogance, their cruelty. It was the kind of behavior she had seen escalate into something far more dangerous. As she wheeled up the ramp to her front porch, she noticed something out of place. A beer can sat on the step, its contents spilled across the wood. Camille frowned. She hadn't left it there, and she hadn't had visitors. Her instincts kicked in. She scanned the area, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. There was no sign of movement, no sound other than the wind rustling the trees. But she knew better than to dismiss the feeling that she was being watched. That night, as Camille sat by the fireplace, her thoughts drifted to her past. She hadn't always been confined to a wheelchair. Once she had been a force to be reckoned with, a shadow, a ghost, a highly trained operative whose missions were whispered about in the darkest corners of the military. The injury that had ended her career hadn't taken away her skills. It had only forced her to adapt. As the fire crackled, Camille made a quiet decision. She wouldn't allow these men to disrupt her peace. If they returned, she would be ready. The Outlaws, meanwhile, were camped just outside of town, their campfire casting flickering shadows against the rocks. Scar leaned back, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "She's got some nerve," he said, exhaling smoke. "Think she's some kind of tough guy," one of his men said, tossing a rock into the fire. Scar's grin returned. "We'll see how tough she is when we pay her a visit." The others laughed, their voices echoing into the night. Unbeknownst to them, Camille was already preparing. Her time as an assassin had taught her that peace wasn't something you waited for. It was something you fought to protect. The morning sun rose over Redstone, but the unease in Camille's heart lingered. As she moved about her small home, her mind replayed Scar's mocking words from the diner. She'd faced plenty of threats in her past life, but this was different. These men were predators, and predators didn't stop until they were stopped. Camille wheeled herself out to her garden, the scent of lavender and rosemary wafting through the air as she watered her plants. It was her routine, her moment of calm, but today it felt hollow. Her instincts told her something was brewing. Her fears were confirmed when she spotted a crude spray-painted symbol on her fence, a skull with crossed knives beneath it. She tightened her grip on her wheelchair's handles. The message was clear. They weren't done with her. Later that day, Camille visited the town sheriff's office. Sheriff Tully, a grizzled man in his 50s, greeted her with a nod as she rolled in. "Camille," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What brings you here?" She handed him a photo she'd taken of the vandalism. "The men who showed up at Jake's yesterday. They've started targeting me." Tully frowned as he studied the image. "These boys are trouble, no doubt about it. But this? It's just a scare tactic." Camille's eyes narrowed. "Scare tactics lead to worse. If you don't deal with them now, someone's going to get hurt." Tully sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I'll talk to them. Make it clear they're not welcome here. But unless they commit a crime we can charge them with, my hands are tied." Camille held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "You talk to them, Sheriff, but don't wait too long." That evening, Camille prepared herself. She had hoped her days of confrontation were behind her, but the spray-painted skull on her fence was a reminder that some battles couldn't be avoided. She retrieved a small box from beneath her bed, opening it to reveal an array of tools from her past life: a tactical knife, a compact pistol, and a pair of gloves designed for precision work. These weren't the weapons of a soldier. They were the tools of an assassin. She spent hours reinforcing her property. Motion-activated lights were installed around the perimeter, and tripwires rigged with small noise alarms were set in strategic locations. Camille knew better than to rely solely on brute force. Strategy was her weapon, and the Outlaws would learn that the hard way. Meanwhile, at the edge of town, the Outlaws were plotting. Scar leaned against his motorcycle, a bottle of whiskey in hand. "The sheriff came by," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Told us to behave." One of his men snorted. "What are we, kids?" Scar chuckled, taking a swig from the bottle. "Exactly. So let's give them something to talk about." Mason, the burliest of the group, grinned. "That woman at the diner, she got under your skin." Scar's expression darkened. "She thinks she's better than us. We'll show her what happens when you disrespect us." Their plan was simple: intimidate Camille further, make her regret standing up to them. They didn't realize they were walking into the jaws of a predator far deadlier than they could imagine. Just before midnight, Camille's motion detectors lit up the yard. She sat in her living room, her senses on high alert as she watched the camera feed. The Outlaws were here. Scar and two others prowled along the edge of her property, testing the tripwires. When one of the alarms went off, they laughed, mocking what they assumed was a feeble attempt at defense. "What's the matter?" Scar called out, his voice echoing through the night. "Too scared to come outside?" Camille didn't respond. She moved silently through her house, positioning herself near a back window with a clear view of their movements. Her pistol rested on the windowsill, ready but not yet necessary. The Outlaws moved closer, emboldened by her silence. Scar kicked over a potted plant near the porch, smirking. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Just because you've got some pity story about being a vet?" His words cut through the night, but Camille remained calm. She had learned long ago that anger clouded judgment. Instead, she waited, observing their patterns, noting their weaknesses. When Scar reached for the front door, Camille activated the floodlights, bathing the yard in harsh white light. The sudden brightness startled the Outlaws, and they shielded their eyes. "You've had your fun." Camille's voice rang out, steady and cold. "Leave now." Scar squinted toward the house, his grin returning. "Or what? You gonna wheel yourself out here and stop us?" Camille's silence unnerved them. Mason muttered, "Something's not right." Scar waved him off. "Relax. She's bluffing." But Camille wasn't bluffing. With a flick of a switch, she triggered a second alarm, a deafening sound that echoed through the yard. The Outlaws cursed, stumbling back as their confidence began to waver. "Last warning," Camille said, her voice firm. Get off my property. Scar hesitated, his bravado faltering. But before he could respond, the distant sound of sirens reached their ears. The sheriff was on his way. Let's go, Mason urged, tugging at Scar's arm. Scar spat on the ground, glaring at the house. This isn't over. The outlaws retreated into the night, leaving behind a trail of crushed plants and broken bottles. Camille exhaled, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She knew they'd be back, but so would she, stronger, smarter, and more prepared than ever. The morning after the confrontation, the first rays of sunlight painted Redstone in shades of gold, but Camille Shaw remained vigilant. The events of the previous night had confirmed what she already knew. The outlaws weren't going to back down. If anything, they were emboldened, but so was she. Camille rolled herself onto the porch, surveying the damage left behind. A shattered pot lay on its side, dirt spilling across the wooden boards. The spray-painted skull on her fence stood as a mocking reminder of their presence. Her jaw tightened as she wheeled closer to inspect the marks, her mind already strategizing her next move. Her years in the military had taught her one thing above all else. You didn't wait for danger to come to you. You took the fight to it. Later that morning, Camille paid a visit to her neighbor, Alice, a retired teacher who lived a few houses down. Alice had always been a quiet ally, offering Camille fresh vegetables from her garden and the occasional baked pie. As Camille approached, she noticed Alice standing by her mailbox, her expression troubled. "Camille," Alice called, her voice laced with worry. "Did you hear about what happened to the Johnsons?" Camille's brows furrowed. "No. What happened?" "Someone broke into their barn last night," Alice said, lowering her voice as though the outlaws could hear her. "They didn't steal much, but they trashed the place, left some kind of symbol on the door." Camille's stomach sank. "A skull?" Alice nodded. "How did you know?" Camille glanced toward the horizon, where the outlaws had disappeared the night before. "They're sending a message." At the sheriff's office, Camille found Sheriff Tully deep in conversation with one of his deputies. He looked up as she rolled in, his expression dark. "Camille," he greeted her, standing up. "I was just about to call you." "I heard about the Johnsons," she said, cutting to the chase. "It's the same group," Tully nodded. "We're putting together a report, but without hard evidence linking them to the scene, we're stuck. These boys know how to stay just outside the law." Camille's lips pressed into a thin line. "So you're telling me you can't do anything?" "I'm telling you we're working on it," Tully replied, his tone firm. "But, Camille, you need to be careful. They've already targeted you. Don't give them a reason to escalate." Camille held his gaze, her voice steady. "They're already escalating, and if you won't stop them, I will." That afternoon, Camille began fortifying her home. She ordered supplies online, materials to reinforce her windows, advanced motion sensors, and cameras with night vision. She also dusted off an old chest stored in the back of her closet, opening it to reveal a collection of military-grade gear, tactical gloves, a lightweight chest rig, and a collection of knives she had kept for emergencies. This was one of them. As she unpacked her supplies, she couldn't help but think of her days in the field. Her mind flashed back to a mission in the Middle East, where she and her unit had been tasked with taking out a high-value target in enemy territory. The stakes had been high, and every move had required precision and nerves of steel. Now, in a quiet desert town, she found herself preparing for a similar kind of battle. The outlaws, meanwhile, were making their own preparations. Scar paced in the parking lot of the rundown motel they had made their base, his frustration bubbling over. "She thinks she can scare us," he muttered, kicking a can across the lot. "We're not running from some cripple." Mason, seated on the hood of a truck, shrugged. "She's smarter than we thought. That alarm system of hers spooked the boys." Scar turned on him, his face twisted in anger. "Then we hit her harder. No more games. Tonight, we show her who's in charge." As dusk fell, Camille walked the perimeter of her property one last time, checking every sensor and every trap she had set. Each step was calculated, every detail meticulously planned. She had learned long ago that preparation was the key to survival. When night fell, she sat in her living room, her laptop open to the camera feed. The screens displayed the yard in crisp black and white images, every corner illuminated by the faint glow of the motion sensors. She didn't have to wait long. At just past midnight, the cameras lit up. The outlaws were back, their figures moving like shadows through the yard. Scar led the charge, a crowbar slung over his shoulder and a determined sneer on his face. Camille remained calm, her eyes scanning the feed. She could see their patterns, their overconfidence evident in every step. They thought they had the upper hand. They were wrong. When Scar reached the porch, he raised the crowbar, ready to smash the door. But the moment the metal touched the wood, an explosion of sound erupted, a piercing siren that sent the outlaws stumbling back. "What the hell?" Scar yelled, covering his ears. Camille's voice rang out from a hidden speaker, cold and steady. "I warned you." The floodlights blazed to life, illuminating the yard in stark white. The outlaws were momentarily blinded, cursing as they scrambled for cover. Scar, however, refused to retreat. "Come out here, Shaw," he shouted. "Face us!" Camille didn't answer. Instead, she activated another trap, a series of noisemakers hidden in the bushes that created the illusion of movement all around them. The outlaws panicked, their bravado crumbling. "She's playing with us," Mason hissed, his grip tightening on his weapon. "No," Scar snarled, his voice laced with fury. "We take her down. Now." But as they advanced, Camille prepared for the next phase of her plan. They had underestimated her for the last time. The night air crackled with tension as Camille Shaw watched the outlaws stumble through her property. The floodlights cast long, sharp shadows across the yard, illuminating their movements. They were confused and angry, a dangerous combination, but Camille was calm. Years of training had taught her that fear was a tool, one she could wield with precision. Scar waved his crowbar wildly, his frustration mounting. "She's got traps everywhere," he shouted, his voice echoing across the desert. "Enough games. Let's take her out." From her vantage point inside the house, Camille observed their every move through her camera feed. She noted their weapons, their lack of coordination, and their growing desperation. They thought they were hunters. They didn't realize they were prey. Scar gestured for Mason and another outlaw, Briggs, to flank the house. "She can't cover every angle," he growled. "We'll smoke her out." The men split up, disappearing into the shadows beyond the floodlights. Camille's cameras tracked them, her fingers dancing over the keyboard to adjust her monitors. When Mason approached a side window, she triggered a second alarm, an ear-splitting shriek that sent him stumbling backward. "What the hell is she?" Mason muttered, his hands pressed to his ears. "She's one step ahead of you," Camille whispered to herself, her lips curling into a grim smile. Camille's mind flashed back to her military days, a time when she was known not just for her physical abilities, but for her strategic brilliance. She had been the ghost in the shadows, the one sent in to dismantle enemy operations with precision and stealth. Her injury hadn't taken that from her. If anything, it had made her sharper. She moved to her next position, retrieving a compact, silenced pistol from her desk. She wasn't eager to use it, but she would if it came to that. Her goal was control, not chaos. Outside, Scar regrouped with his men near the porch. "Enough of this!" he snarled, his voice cracking with frustration. "We go in, grab her, and finish this." Briggs hesitated. "What if she's armed?" Scar turned on him, his face a mask of rage. "She's in a wheelchair, Briggs. What's she gonna do? Roll us to death?" The men laughed nervously, their confidence faltering under the weight of their leader's bravado. That was their mistake. As Scar stepped onto the porch, Camille activated another trap. A hidden device released a cloud of pepper spray, forcing the men to retreat, coughing and cursing. "She's a damn psychopath," Mason wheezed, his eyes watering. Scar, undeterred, wiped his face with his sleeve and kicked open the front door. "Enough of this crap." Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Camille had positioned herself near the staircase, her pistol trained on the doorway. She waited, her breathing steady, her heartbeat slow. Timing was everything. Scar entered first, his crowbar raised. He scanned the room, his rage blinding him to the subtle signs of a trap. Camille's voice rang out from the shadows, low and commanding. "You shouldn't have come here." Scar froze, turning toward the sound. "Show yourself." Camille didn't respond. Instead, she triggered the final phase of her plan. A series of strobe lights burst to life, disorienting the men as they stumbled into the living room. Scar swung his crowbar wildly, his movements erratic. From her position, Camille emerged with calculated precision. She moved silently, her wheelchair gliding across the floor as she aimed her pistol at Scar's chest. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice sharp as a blade. Scar turned, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "You think I'm scared of you?" Camille tilted her head slightly, her expression cold. "You should be." The sound of sirens pierced the night, growing louder as they approached. Camille had called the sheriff before the confrontation, ensuring backup was on its way. Scar's bravado faltered as the reality of his situation set in. "You're bluffing," he sneered. Camille didn't flinch. "Try me." Scar hesitated, his grip on the crowbar loosening. Mason and Briggs, still reeling from the pepper spray, exchanged panicked glances. The front door burst open, and Sheriff Tully stormed in, his deputies behind him. "Drop your weapons," he barked, his gun drawn. Scar cursed under his breath, letting the crowbar fall to the floor. The deputies quickly subdued the men, cuffing them as Tully approached Camille. "You all right?" the sheriff asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Camille nodded, lowering her pistol. "They underestimated me. That was their first mistake." As the outlaws were hauled away, Scar glared at Camille, his ego bruised, but his anger unrelenting. "This isn't over," he growled. Camille's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Oh, it is. You just don't know it yet." The deputies escorted the men out, leaving Camille and the sheriff alone in the quiet house. Tully turned to her, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You really had to handle this on your own, huh?" he said. "They weren't going to stop," Camille replied. "And I wasn't going to let them win." Tully sighed, tipping his hat. "Fair enough. Just try not to scare the hell out of my deputies next time." Camille chuckled softly. "No promises." As the sirens faded into the distance, Camille sat on her porch, the night air cool against her skin. The adrenaline was wearing off, but her resolve remained strong. She knew this wasn't the end, but she was ready for whatever came next. The stars above shone brightly, their light a quiet reminder of the peace she had fought to protect and would fight to keep. The morning after the confrontation, Camille Shaw wheeled herself out onto her porch, her mind still replaying the events of the night. The outlaws were in custody, at least for now, but her instincts told her it wasn't over. People like Zagar didn't accept defeat easily. She had faced their kind before, in war zones, in back alleys, in situations where survival was never guaranteed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up. Sheriff Tully stepped out, holding a file in one hand and tipping his hat with the other. "Morning, Camille." "Sheriff," she replied, her tone even. "I assume you didn't come all the way out here for coffee." Tully chuckled, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. "You're right. I've got some news, and you're not going to like it." Inside, Tully spread the file across Camille's kitchen table. It contained mugshots, police reports, and scribbled notes. Camille scanned the documents, her sharp eyes picking out the details. "Scar's real name is Randall Decker," Tully began, pointing to a heavily stamped report. "Been in and out of prison for years. Armed robbery, assault, racketeering. The works." Camille nodded. "And the others?" "Mason and Briggs are small time compared to him," Tully said. "Decker's the leader, and he's connected to something bigger." He handed her a second file. Inside were grainy photos of a warehouse on the outskirts of a neighboring town, trucks loaded with crates, armed men standing guard. "We've been investigating this for months," Tully continued. "It's a smuggling ring. Guns, drugs, stolen goods. Decker's crew works for them, running errands, enforcing their operations." Camille's jaw tightened. So, Scar wasn't just causing trouble for fun. He was using this town as a cover. "Exactly," Tully said. "And now that you've taken him down a peg, his bosses won't be happy. They don't tolerate failure." Camille leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew how criminal organizations worked. Cutthroat, hierarchical, and ruthless. If Scar's crew had been running errands for someone higher up, it meant Redstone wasn't just a random target. It was part of a larger operation. "They'll send someone else." Camille said finally. Someone meaner, smarter. Tully nodded grimly. That's my worry. And with Decker and his crew behind bars, they might decide you're the problem. Camille met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Let them try. That afternoon, Camille began digging deeper. She had contacts, old friends from her military days who owed her favors. She made a few calls, asking about Decker's associates and their operations. The answers she received were grim, but not surprising. One of her contacts, a former intelligence officer named Reyes, confirmed her suspicions. The smuggling ring's run by a guy named Victor Grayson, Reyes said over the phone. Ex-mercenary, runs his operations like a military unit, disciplined, brutal, and efficient. Camille frowned. What's his interest in Redstone? Low-profile routes, Reyes explained. Quiet towns where no one asks questions. If Decker's crew was here, it means Grayson saw potential. Taking them out disrupted his business, and guys like him don't let that slide. Camille's grip tightened on the phone. Thanks, Reyes. I owe you. Just stay sharp, Shaw, Reyes replied. Grayson's no joke. That evening, Camille reviewed the information she had gathered. It painted a clear picture. Redstone was part of a larger network, a cog in a machine that thrived on secrecy and fear. By standing up to Scar and his crew, she had exposed the town, and herself, to a much larger threat. But Camille wasn't one to back down. She began preparing for the next phase. Her property was already fortified, but now she focused on intelligence. She installed additional cameras to cover blind spots and rigged a few drones for aerial surveillance. If anyone came near her home, or the town, she would know. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit warehouse 2 towns over, Victor Grayson reviewed a report handed to him by one of his men. The details of Scar's failure were laid out in stark terms. The botched harassment, the arrests, and the role Camille Shaw had played. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. A disabled veteran, he mused, tapping his fingers on the desk. And she managed to take down Decker and his men. The man across from him shifted uncomfortably. She's resourceful. Grayson's lips curled into a thin smile. Resourceful. Interesting. He stood, his towering figure casting a shadow over the room. Send a team. Let's see just how resourceful she really is. As the night fell, Camille sat on her porch, her senses alert. The desert was quiet, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way. The battle with Scar's crew had been personal, but the one ahead would be different, bigger, deadlier. She glanced at the horizon, where the faint glow of distant headlights signaled the approach of something new. Her past had taught her many things, but one lesson stood out above all. When the storm comes, you don't run, you stand your ground. And Camille was ready to fight. The desert night stretched silent and vast around Camille Shaw's home, but she knew better than to trust its tranquility. Somewhere out there, trouble was brewing, and she could feel it in the stillness. Her cameras picked up nothing unusual, but the faint sound of a car engine in the distance made her grip tighten on her pistol. Camille wasn't afraid. Fear had long ago become a companion she knew how to tame. Tonight, it was focus she embraced, her senses sharp, her instincts alive. If Victor Grayson's men were coming, they would find not a victim, but a predator lying in wait. At the edge of Redstone, 2 black SUVs rolled quietly into town, their engines purring like predators on the hunt. The vehicles stopped just outside Camille's property, and a group of 5 men stepped out, each dressed in black tactical gear. They moved with precision, their leader gesturing silently to fan out and cover all angles. Remember, the leader whispered into his radio. No mistakes. The boss wants her taken alive. The men nodded and began their approach, their footsteps barely audible on the sandy ground. They didn't realize they were already being watched. Inside her home, Camille's monitors lit up as her motion detectors caught movement near the western fence. She adjusted the camera angle, her sharp eyes counting 5 figures moving in formation. They weren't like Scar's crew. These men were professionals, but so was she. Camille tapped a few keys, activating the perimeter defenses. A low hum filled the air as a series of lights blinked on, flooding the area with harsh illumination. The men froze, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the yard. Welcome to my home. Camille's voice rang out from a hidden speaker, calm and steady. You should have called ahead. The leader gestured for his men to hold their positions. We don't want any trouble, he called out, his tone diplomatic. Come out and we can talk. Camille let out a soft chuckle. If you didn't want trouble, you shouldn't have come. The leader motioned for two of his men to move forward, their weapons drawn. As they reached the porch, one of them triggered a tripwire. Instantly, a series of noisemakers erupted, disorienting them as Camille's voice spoke again, this time colder. Second warning, leave, or I'll make you regret staying. The men hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. The leader barked into his radio. Stay focused. She's just trying to rattle us. But Camille wasn't trying. She was succeeding. From her position inside, she activated another trap. This time, a burst of smoke erupted near the porch, enveloping the advancing men in a choking cloud. They coughed and stumbled back, their composure beginning to crack. The leader gritted his teeth, frustration evident. Enough of this, he growled. Move in. The team advanced together, spreading out to flank the house. Camille watched their movements on her monitors, her mind calculating every step. She reached for her compact pistol, sliding it into a holster on her wheelchair. Then, with practiced ease, she wheeled herself to the back door. As one of the men rounded the corner, Camille moved swiftly. She struck with precision, using the butt of her pistol to disarm him before locking his arm in a calculated hold. The man gasped in pain as she whispered, You should have stayed home. She released him with a shove, sending him stumbling into the bushes before disappearing back into the shadows. Inside, the remaining men regrouped, their movements more frantic now. Camille's traps had worked. They were rattled, their confidence shaken. But she knew the leader wouldn't retreat without a fight. She positioned herself near the staircase, waiting as the leader and his second-in-command entered through the broken front door. They moved cautiously, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Shaw, the leader called out, his voice tight. This doesn't have to end badly. Just come with us. Camille's voice echoed from the shadows. It already ended badly. For you. Before he could react, Camille activated a hidden mechanism. A heavy net dropped from above, ensnaring the leader and pinning him to the floor. His second-in-command spun around, his weapon aimed. But Camille was faster. A well-placed shot disarmed him, the pistol clattering to the ground. By the time the sirens reached her property, the remaining men were subdued, their weapons confiscated, and their leader trapped like an animal. Sheriff Tully and his deputies arrived in force, their lights painting the scene in red and blue. Tully stepped out of his vehicle, his eyes wide as he took in the aftermath. Camille, he said, shaking his head. You really don't do anything halfway, do you? Camille wheeled forward, her expression calm but resolute. They underestimated me. That was their first mistake. Tully gestured for his deputies to round up the men. As they hauled the leader away, he glared at Camille, his voice dripping with venom. This isn't over. Camille met his gaze, her voice cold as steel. It is for you. As the vehicles disappeared into the night, Camille sat on her porch, the adrenaline finally fading. She looked out at the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to break. She had won this battle, but she knew the war wasn't over. For now, though, Redstone was safe, and so was she. The first light of dawn crept over the desert, painting Redstone in hues of orange and pink. The town was waking up to a new day, unaware of the battle that had unfolded the night before. At Camille Shaw's property, the aftermath of the confrontation was evident. Trampled bushes, scattered equipment, and the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. Camille wheeled herself onto her porch, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The sheriff's deputies had taken Victor Grayson's men into custody, but the sense of finality eluded her. She knew how people like Grayson operated. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. By mid-morning, Sheriff Tully arrived, his truck kicking up a cloud of dust as it rolled to a stop. He stepped out, a weary expression etched on his face, and approached Camille, who was tending to her garden. Morning, Sheriff, she said without looking up, her tone even. Morning, Tully replied, removing his hat. Thought I'd stop by, see how you're holding up. Camille paused, resting her hands on her knees. I'm fine. You get anything useful out of them? Tully sighed. A little. They confirmed what you already suspected. Grayson sent them. They were supposed to scare you, maybe bring you in. Clearly, that didn't go as planned. Camille smirked. No, it didn't. Tully hesitated before continuing. Grayson's not happy. Word is, he's pulling back for now. But we both know he won't let this go. Camille met his gaze, her expression steady. Then I'll be ready when he tries again. Later that day, Camille found herself the unlikely center of attention in town. Word of her bravery had spread quickly, and neighbors stopped by to offer their thanks and support. Ruby, the owner of the diner, brought over a freshly baked pie. You're the talk of the town, Camille, Ruby said, setting the pie on the kitchen counter. People are saying you should run for mayor. Camille chuckled, shaking her head. I think I'll stick to gardening. Well, whatever you decide to do, we're lucky to have you, Ruby said with a warm smile. You've shown us what it means to stand up for yourself. As the day wore on, Camille reflected on the events that had brought her here. She had left behind a life of danger and chaos, seeking peace in a small town. But trouble had found her, just as it always seemed to. Yet this time, something felt different. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a reminder that her skills could still be used for good. That evening, Camille sat on her porch, the desert wind cool against her skin. The sound of a car engine broke the stillness, and she looked up to see Tully's truck pulling into the driveway. He stepped out, holding a folder under his arm. What's this? Camille asked as he handed it to her. Some intel we've gathered on Grayson and his operation, Tully said. Figured you'd want to know what we're up against. Camille opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. Photos, maps, and handwritten notes detailed Grayson's network and its reach. It was a sprawling operation, with roots in multiple states and connections to dangerous individuals. This isn't just about Redstone, she said, her voice quiet but firm. No, it's not, Tully agreed. But you've already proven you're not the kind of person they should have messed with. That gives us an edge. Camille closed the folder, her mind racing with possibilities. Thanks, Sheriff. Don't mention it, Tully said, tipping his hat. Just don't go starting a war without letting me know first. Camille smiled faintly. No promises. As the stars began to fill the sky, Camille sat quietly, the folder resting on her lap. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she felt ready. For the first time in years, the weight of her past didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a weapon she could wield. The desert stretched out before her, vast and quiet. Camille Shaw had fought for her peace, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. The fight wasn't over, but tonight, the victory was hers. The days following the confrontation brought a new sense of calm to Redstone. The desert town, once rattled by the arrival of Victor Grayson's men, seemed to breathe easier. For Camille Shaw, the quiet was both a relief and a reminder. She had fought to protect her sanctuary, but the battle had opened doors she thought were closed forever. One morning, as Camille tended to her garden, a familiar sound broke the stillness. Sheriff Tully's truck pulled up, and he stepped out, holding a stack of papers. Morning, Camille, he greeted, his tone lighter than usual. Sheriff, she replied, wiping her hands on her pants. What brings you here? Tully handed her the papers. Thought you'd like to know. Grayson's been sighted 2 towns over. Word is, he's regrouping, but he's steering clear of Redstone, for now. Camille scanned the papers, her sharp eyes catching every detail. For now, she echoed. That means he's planning something. Tully nodded. Probably, but the way you handled his men, you've put the fear of God into them. That buys us time. Camille smirked. Time's all I need. As the day unfolded, Camille received a steady stream of visitors. Her neighbors, once wary of her quiet demeanor, now saw her as a hero. They brought baked goods, shared kind words, and even offered to help clean up her property. Ruby from the diner arrived with a bouquet of wildflowers. Camille, she said, placing the flowers on the table, you've given this town something it's been missing for a long time. Hope. Camille chuckled softly. I didn't do it alone. This town's stronger than it looks. Ruby smiled. Maybe, but you reminded us of that. Don't forget it. That evening, Camille sat on her porch, a cool breeze brushing against her skin. The folder Tully had given her lay open on the table beside her, its contents organized into neat piles. She had spent hours reviewing the information, her mind crafting scenarios, strategies, and contingencies. Her phone buzzed, breaking her focus. It was a message from Reyes, her old contact in the intelligence world. Grayson's network is unraveling. Keep your guard up. He won't go quietly. Camille stared at the message for a moment, then set the phone down. She knew Reyes was right, but she wasn't afraid. If Grayson came back, she would be ready. The stars began to emerge as Camille reflected on her journey. The life she had tried to leave behind had found her again, but this time she didn't resent it. Her skills, her training, her resilience, they were all part of who she was, and for the first time in years, she felt at peace with that. Redstone had become more than a hiding place. It was a home, and Camille was determined to protect it, no matter what. If this story inspired you, remember that courage and resilience come in many forms. Camille's journey reminds us that strength isn't about perfection. It's about standing your ground when it matters most. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and activate the notifications bell for more powerful stories like this one. Share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength.